Thanks. Thank you very much. Ooh, the lights are bright. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, absolutely none of which I understood. Because I'm one of those, you know them very well, the Englishmen who know no other foreign languages. So my apologies for speaking in English, but I hope you will understand me better that way. I'm going to talk about reporting on science and on the environment and the boundaries between the two, which is what I do. I'm going to talk about some of the main issues that I've written about in recent years, environmental issues, and how they are underpinned by science. So the two main areas are climate change and water, the world water crisis, if I can put it that way. But let me begin describing what I do and the way that I do it. I wear a number of hats. One of them is an author of books. The other is as an environmental consultant, as you heard, I think, for New Scientist magazine, which is a weekly news magazine published in the UK and in the US and Australia, and articles are reprinted here regularly in Internazionale. In effect, I write on the environment for scientists and science for environmentalists. So I try and get the science right on environmental debates, and I try and explain to scientists why they need to understand environmental issues. A lot of people assume that I'm an environmentalist, a campaigner. They think all writers on environmental issues are campaigners. But I take a slightly different view. I regard environmental issues as extremely important, of course. I've spent my life writing about them. But I try not to take sides in many of the debates. I'm an investigator, perhaps, rather than a campaigner. And I think there is a difference. I'm genuinely uncertain, for instance, whether fighting climate change can be done with technical fixes, just technology, or whether it will need huge changes in our lifestyles as well. I think that's a fantastically important issue, a really big question, but I must admit I don't really know the answer. If questions afterwards, I could give you some thoughts, but I don't actually believe I know the answer. And I hope that not knowing the answers helps me to report the debates. If I thought I knew all the answers, I think I would be a bad reporter. I also try to report honestly what environmentalists are doing wrong and where they're going wrong. I think as a result of that, I knew before many environmentalists were prepared to admit it, that biofuels were going to be a big problem, that they weren't the solution to climate change, as many environmentalists used to say. So I hope that by being independent, I can spot problems earlier than the more committed environmentalist. But if I'm not strictly speaking an environmentalist, I'm not a scientist either. For one thing, I don't have a good enough science education. Indeed, I know for a fact that these days I would never get a job on New Scientist. 20 years ago, I was news editor on the magazine, but now they like people with doctorates, with PhDs, with letters after their name, and I don't have any. So, I value, however, that independence from the scientific community. I think that many scientists, including many science journalists, form a kind of priesthood, if I can put it that way. They think they have to be on the side of science and of scientists, and they sort of speak for each other, so that science journalists are not usually prepared to be critical of scientists. And I don't like that. I think it's best to be outside the priesthood looking in. There's a big danger among specialist correspondents of all sorts, not just science journalists, but all sorts of specialist reporters, that they get too close to the people that they write about every day. They think in the same way. Back to this word priesthood, which I think describes it quite well. I think reporters should be more separate than that. Many scientists and many science journalists also like to think of science as being all about ideas, about abstract ideas, about proofs and hypotheses and so on. But I think there's much more to it. I know there is much more to it than that. Often science is actually about personalities and careers and reputations and egos and big battles between groups of scientists. These are, they're like the rest of us. They're like a good battle. Too many science journalists don't report those battles. They lose sight of them because they're too close. So in a lot of areas, there are big battles among scientists, and whoever wins the argument might get a Nobel Prize, while whoever loses could be out of a job or lose their funding or be disgraced. So these are important facts in the day-to-day work of scientists. They don't get in the scientific literature in the big journals, but they're facts nonetheless. And a good science journalist needs to report about those battles, to interview the personalities, and to find out what's going on behind the scenes, what really motivates scientists sometimes, these personal issues. And in that sense, science journalism should operate by many of the same rules as other sorts of journalism. It's not quite celebrity journalism, but it certainly has to have personalities in the story. But having said that, we have to be careful because there is real scientific truth out there too, and we have to report that as well as the battles. And that can be quite hard to do. In a lot of journalism, the main job is to find, I guess, two sides of an argument. Report what they both say in a spirit of balance, of balanced reporting. On the one side, we say this, on the other side, they say that, and give them equal space and equal time. Now, I hate that word balance because it suggests that the two arguments always have equal value, and often they don't. And if that's the case, it's the job of the journalist to say so, to give a context to a debate, if you like, and to explain who's on one side, whether most scientists are on one side or most scientists are on the other side. Now, the most obvious example of that today is the debates about climate change, and I'm going to talk a bit about climate change. Some journalists who write about the subject always give space to the people that get called the skeptics, or the deniers, the people who deny that humans are changing the climate or are even capable of it. That's especially true in the US, but it's true everywhere. Journalists tend to want to give them equal space. So they say, well, the scientists who believe in climate change say one thing, and they feel they have to then give paragraphs to a small group of scientists who say they don't really believe in man-made climate change. Now, this may be balance in the rules of journalism, but I think it's rather kind of dumb balance. It's not a real balance. It's not unbiased, and it's not honest. It's not an honest way of reporting climate change. Because the truth is that virtually all of the scientists who have looked at climate know that the world has been warming for the past 40 years, and that there is no known mechanism by which the whole world could have warmed in the way that it has naturally. The big influences that we know, natural influences that we know on climate change, mainly the sun and volcanic eruptions, would have actually been cooling the planet over the last 40 years. They can't possibly explain the very strong warming that we've seen. And also, scientists have known for 200 years that certain gases, known as greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, warm the planet. This is not new environmental theory. This is really old science. It goes back to the origins, really, of modern physics. And we've known for 60 years how we have been putting these gases into the atmosphere. We've been measuring for 60 years how those gases are accumulating ever higher levels each year. Very regular increase. It would frankly be fantastic. It would be close to unbelievable if the planet was not warming as a result of that accumulation of greenhouse gases. So there is no sensible scientific debate about this. It is basic physics, really basic physics, known about for 2 centuries. And yet, many journalists who write about this topic do not say that clearly. They suggest that there is some uncertainty about whether these gases warm the planet. There really is no uncertainty. The only question is exactly how much and exactly what the consequences will be. So when journalists equivocate and don't make this clear, they are doing their audiences, they are doing their readers a disservice. And really, they should stop doing it. They have to be clear about where the center of the scientific argument is on that. But that's not the end of the story about climate change. In fact, this is really where I begin my story about the new science of climate change. Now, I've been reporting on climate change for 18 years now. And the more I learn, the more I go and see for myself, and the more I talk to scientists, I have to say that more scared I get. In the end, after some years, I wrote a book about it called The Last Generation, or in the US it was called With Speed and Violence, Why Scientists Fear Tipping Points in Climate Change. And that perhaps describes what the new science of climate change is suggesting. It's suggesting something much faster, much more violent than has been previously thought. And I've spent quite a lot of time in the last few years trying to report on this new science, and I put it in my book. So I want to talk about that for a few minutes. With climate change, we've been interfering with some of the fundamental processes that make life on Earth habitable. Scientists will talk about the carbon cycle as one of the fundamental processes on the planet. By global warming, the things that we're doing to the atmosphere, we're starting to change the carbon cycle, and that has a profound effect on the atmosphere and our environment. Environmentalists talk a lot about how we're endangering the survival of species and precious habitats. But this time, I think and the scientists tell me, it is our own survival now which is at stake. We're not talking about saving the tigers or saving the whales or saving the elephants. We're talking about saving Homo sapiens, our species, or at any rate, our modern civilization and the very large population that we now have on the planet. That's what's under threat from climate change. Interestingly, this is one story where the scientists often use more scary language than the environmentalists. I found this very striking. For some years, environmentalists really weren't very certain whether climate change was an important issue, and it took the scientists to persuade them. I actually still don't think that Greenpeace and some other groups have quite understood how big climate change is for the planet and for us. And equally interesting, I think among the scientists, it's not the young researchers who lead the way. In many environmental debates, it's the young, sort of new scientists trying to make a name for themselves who shout the loudest about some new environmental threat. But on climate change, it's different. It's the people who've been in the field the longest. It's the professors with the biggest reputations who often talk in the most dramatic language about climate change. Men like, I remembered recently, Bert Bolin, who was a very famous Swedish climate scientist who died earlier this year, a man with a fantastic reputation who spoke in really dramatic languages about the consequences of climate change. And I think the fact that it's the old, experienced, best-known scientists who speak like this tells us something about the importance of the issue. Climate change is not like another environmental topic that may come or go. This is the big one. The idea for my book, The Last Generation, came while I sat at a science conference in Exeter, organized by the British government in early 2005. Scientists came from all over the world to discuss climate change, and I was amazed at what I heard. Most journalists just covered the press conference, and these were quite formal affairs. The language was rather neutral. But inside the conference, if you listen to what the scientists had to say in the body of the conference when they were talking among themselves, for those of us who stuck around and listened to it, the language is very different. The scientists started talking in almost apocalyptic terms. It sounded almost like science fiction. Chris Rapley, the director of one of Britain's top agencies, the British Antarctic Survey, began talking about climatic monsters, he said, that were even now being awoken. If we thought climate change was bad, they were saying, the new data coming in suggested that it could soon get very much worse. I was intrigued and alarmed by the language that he and others were using. And then later in the year, I heard George Bush's top climate scientist, a brave and honest man called Jim Hansen, who's managed somehow to keep his job at NASA despite 8 years of George Bush in the White House. And he told a meeting, august meeting of the American Geophysical Union, quotes, "We're on the precipice of climate system tipping points beyond which there is no redemption." No redemption. Now, that's not really the language of science as we understand it. Not even Greenpeace, I think, would use such a word. But he did, because he meant what he said. He was trying very hard to communicate with us the importance of what he was seeing in his research. So I decided to write my book to introduce Rapley's monsters and Hansen's tipping points to the world and to ask the question whether we've passed some point of no return. And as I started work on the book, scientists were almost beating a path to my door to tell me about the monsters that they had found. I had an email out of the blue from a Siberian scientist. The world's biggest frozen bog, he said, was melting fast in Siberia. The permafrost, he said, could soon be releasing into the air billions of tons of greenhouse gases that have been trapped in the ice for tens of thousands of years. I wrote that story for New Scientist magazine, and his warning that day made the front page of the Guardian newspaper in London. It did seem to be a dramatic statement. And we now know, incidentally, that the releases of those gases is already underway. And then rainforest scientists started telling me how the Amazon rainforest is drying out. Soon, their research suggests there could be massive fires, much bigger than we've seen so far, across the Amazon, and most of the forest could turn to desert within a few years as a result of climate change. Really dramatic and sudden events. And then glaciologists, the people who study the world's ice, who are more used to seeing things happen very slowly, started to tell me about dramatic events in Greenland and in Antarctica, which could very likely result in ice sheets disappearing, again, much faster than previously thought, much faster than anything in the reports from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, let me explain this briefly, because I think it's dramatic science, and it kind of shows how scientists begin to feel that climate change is running away, is happening faster than we ever imagined. The conventional view about these big ice sheets on land, you can read this in the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change still. The conventional view is that these blocks, which can be 3 kilometers thick, 3 kilometers deep, they are huge, but they'll melt only slowly. As the air at the surface warms, the heat will work its way gradually down to the base of the ice, melting the ice as it goes. That's the conventional view. Now, this melting will eventually raise sea levels by 10 meters or perhaps more, enough to flood most of the world's great cities and farmland, and it may already be unstoppable. But the general view is that we probably have thousands of years to make our retreat to higher ground. So while it's nasty, it's not an immediate threat, perhaps. But it seems that this conventional view is wrong. The timescales are likely to be far shorter. The reason? Glaciologists forgot about cracks in the ice, about crevasses. They simply forgot about them when they did their original calculations. And these cracks literally change everything. Because what is actually happening on the surface of the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica now is that ice is melting at the surface in the warm summer. It is forming lakes of water, literally lakes of water on the surface of the ice, some kilometers across. And the water in these lakes is draining down the cracks through the ice right to the bottom of the ice sheet. Down, these are huge waterfalls, if you like, the size of the Niagara Falls, one report said a few weeks ago. And there, this water melts the join between the ice and the rock, what has held the ice on the land. It is acting as a lubricant. And the whole ice sheets are starting to float literally downhill towards the ocean. They've become, the anchor has been broken. And the glaciologists can measure this now. Using GPS systems, they can measure how within hours of the lakes at the surface discharging their water down into the depths each summer, these huge masses of ice, 3 kilometers thick, are physically rising up about 0.5 meter to 1 meter. And they're starting to float on the water beneath them. And they're starting to float downhill towards the oceans. This is measurable, and it is, in the estimation of the scientists who are doing the measuring, extremely scary. And that is why there are more icebergs breaking off into the Atlantic Ocean today from Greenland than for a long time. That is why average sea level rise has doubled since the early 1990s. It's still quite slow, but it's doubled in little more than a decade. And many scientists believe that it will double again and again and again. Jim Hansen, who I mentioned earlier, the US scientist at NASA, predicts that sea level rise will be 10 times faster within a few years as Greenland destabilizes. He says that within the next 100 years, we'll be measuring sea level rise, not in centimeters, which is the conventional view or has been, but in meters. Much, much faster. Now, this story is one of a number where scientists are discovering what they call tipping points in the climate system, points of no return, if you like. And it sums up for me why scientists are getting panicky about climate change, because they're coming to realize that their old ideas about climate changing gradually simply does not reflect how the world actually works, and therefore change could be much faster than so far predicted. That is a very big and very new story about climate change, one that is not really reflected in science reporting yet, but it is the new story about climate change. And it's something which the scientists themselves are only really slowly waking up to, because I found in researching the book, each scientist working in his own area, whether it was looking at the Siberian bogs or the Amazon rainforest or the Greenland ice sheet, each in his own area noticed that, he'd found a tipping point. He'd found a point of no return in his own area, in his own research. But they didn't know about the other tipping points that other scientists were finding in other areas. And several of them told me that after reading my book, I don't want to be grand about the book, but really after just putting it all together, after reading my book, until they read the book, they hadn't realized that there were other scientists looking at climate change, discovering these things too. And I think this is an important thing for science journalists to remember. One of the things that science journalists can do is simply to talk to scientists in a lot of different fields and piece together a bigger picture. Most scientists are focused on their small area of particular research, and they're reporting on that. Very few of them have an overview of what's going on. And one of the roles of science journalism, I think, apart from communicating science to the public, is always communicate science to other scientists so that they can put their own work in the right context.